So anyway, yeah. So anyway, I'll try to talk that. I know that I'm not actually amplified through the speakers, so I'll shout and roar. So anyway, can you hear me okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Right. Okay. Right. Okay. So anyway, so we're into what I'm calling the ninth part of the Torah here. So again, these are the first 5 books of the Bible that we're looking at, and we're now into Exodus. And so we're going to be looking at 2 things today. We're going to be looking at the 10 Commandments, and then we're going to be looking at the tabernacle and those pieces of furniture that were inside the tabernacle. So, but anyway, we'll look at first of all the terms of the agreement. This is when God, as we were talking about last week, we were talking about the dispensations and how the first dispensation was God working with Adam and Eve before they sinned, and so prior to them going into sin, this was a perfect world. But then well, actually, it wasn't completely perfect because Satan had already committed sin in heavenly places. And so there was this knowledge of good and evil. But in terms of where Adam and Eve were at the time, they were in a place of innocence. So, but that ended, that first dispensation, that first period of time ended when they committed their trespass. And then it was about the promises of God then coming along, and God then doing different things. But the first time things then go that are written down, because the law, God's not that God didn't have law, but there was oral law, and that was passed down through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so on into Egypt. But then when it comes to Mount Sinai, when they got there a couple of months after they left Egypt, then God says, look, this needs to be written down. This needs to be put, well, I was going to say down on paper, but actually they put it down on stone, So anyway, so the terms of the agreement are this really. So if we look at Exodus chapter 19, verse 4-6, it says this, if you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words which I shall speak to the children of Israel. Now, what I have highlighted there in yellow is if and then. So that's conditional. Okay, so meaning that if there is a certain thing that is in place, then something takes place. So God is giving first of all the condition, which is you need to obey my voice, keep my covenant, and then God does something. If there's no obedience and there's no keeping of the covenant, then the thens don't happen, So, but this was the then response of the people in verses 7 and 8, which is, so Moses came, called for the elders of the people, and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. And then all the people answered together and says, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So the Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So the people are coming back with this conditional agreement and saying, yep, that's us. We will do what you tell us to do. So now God hasn't given them yet the actual codified instruction, but what God says at the beginning of verse 4, it says, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings, brought you to myself. Now, therefore, So when you see the therefore, you have to ask the question, what's the therefore? Therefore, so it is, looking back to the previous statement, which is, you've seen what I've done to the Egyptians, and I was the one that bore you as eagle's wings. You were little fledglings. You didn't know what you were doing, but I brought you out, and I brought you to myself. So God didn't just bring them out to some sort of vacuum. And now they did come out to a wilderness, but God was with them. God was present with them, and so now He gives them the terms of the agreement. If this, then that. So the things that He says here in terms of the if that I have in blue is, one, that you obey, and two, you keep. Okay, so you have to do these things, keep what this agreement is all about. So anytime you see the word covenant in the Bible, covenant is an agreement, but it's not just, it's not like, two of you shaking hands and saying, okay, that's us, thanks very much. And we see loads of agreements, loads of signed bits of paper and all that kind of stuff in our day and age. But really, anytime there's a change of government or a change of policy or a change of something, a lot of these agreements they just get tore up. And but when God makes an agreement, God is making an agreement that is very, very solemn, and people understood this. So, and covenant means literally to cut a deal, and that harkens back to Abraham, chapter 15 in Genesis, where he took animals and he cut them in two, laid them opposite of each other, and then there was that imagery of the smoking oven and the flaming torch passing between those pieces, and those pieces were making a covenant. They were making an agreement. Back in those days, people made agreements like that and covenants, and saying, if I break my side of the covenant, then may I become like these animals, and then the other party would say the same thing. So it was quite serious, so it was a very, very solemn thing. So what he's saying here is, if you obey, you keep, then is what God will do. So the first thing he mentions is that you'll be a special treasure above all people. So you're my people, special because all the earth is mine, he says. And two, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. So he wants this kingdom of people, he wants them to engage with him directly. So, and it's interesting that he uses this idea of kingdom of priests and being a holy, set apart nation. Now that this is quoted in 1 Peter, this particular piece of scripture, in terms of what believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, in terms of the church age, we will be a kingdom of priests. Now, sometimes you go, oh, wait a minute, are we talking about Catholicism here or something? No, we're not. We're talking about, we can, a priest was a man who stood on behalf of the people before God because of the people's weakness. Whereas like a prophet, for instance, a prophet spoke on behalf of God. Okay, so a priest would speak to God on behalf of the people, so he was the intermediary. And so we have a great high priest, and that is the Lord Jesus Christ. He's the one that goes between us and God, as it were, but yet we can be participants and helping each other and encouraging each other and going to God on people's behalf, because that's why we need to pray. That's why we need to go to God and say, God, there's people that I know they can't pray for themselves. They don't know how to pray for themselves, but I can go before God and tell you these things. So, and then God comes back and he says, my grace will be sufficient for you and for these circumstances. So, so it's a great set of terms, and, but what the details of the agreement then is, God can set out what the general terms are, but then we come into chapter 20, which is where the 10 commandments are then laid out. And so we'll talk about each one of those in turn. So this is what God says, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt and out of the house of bondage. So the first thing that God sets out before he gives these 10 words or the 10 commandments is he says, I am the Lord, and then he says, I am the Lord your God. So God is giving his personal name and lending his personal name, as it were, to you and saying, I'm your God as well. So, we have the personal name of God, which is Lord. And this is, you see it there in all capitals, which is the 4 letters of the name of God that cannot be pronounced. So anytime this reading was done in a special meeting or whatever, they wouldn't say what we would call Jehovah or Yahweh. That's an attempt to pronounce that which is unpronounceable. Because the 4 letters, when you put them together in Hebrew, they're just not designed to do that. They're not designed to be pronounced. So, but what they would do is they would say Adonai, which is also translated Lord, but it is a pronounceable version. Okay, so if you go into a version of the Bible called the Tree of Life Bible, which has been translated by Messianic Jews, it's quite a good translation. Anytime you see the word Lord in the Old Testament of their particular translation, they will use the term Adonai. So now, if you were talking, I don't want to use the word casual, but you were talking sort of outside of a formal meeting, and you were say quoting a piece of scripture out loud to your fellow man, you wouldn't even say Adonai, because that's a bit lofty too. So what you would say is the word Hashem, and Hashem meant the name. It's just a reference to the name of God, because you didn't go there, you didn't pronounce it. So they had a great reverence for the name of God, but that name was a very, very personal name, and God is saying, Lord, I am the Lord who brought you out of this land of Egypt, this house of bondage. So the first commandment that is laid out here is, you shall have no other gods before me. So now we live in a day and time where we have a monotheistic system, which means one God. Okay, so we don't have a multiplicity of gods as they did back in Egyptian times or Greek times or Roman times or a whole bunch of other times. But now, so we might say, okay, well, we believe in the one God. Well, actually, we have a bunch of other gods floating around in our day and age. It's called money. It's called pride. It's called self-promotion. All those kinds of things. You may not think that they're idols of wood and stone, and so they're not. But there are things that we actually entertain, we give ourselves to, and we worship. The people that I would work with, that have alcohol and drug problems, well, their God is drink and their God is drugs. Okay, so they give themselves over to those particular things and the practices that are associated with that. And God is saying very, very clearly here, you shall have no other gods before me. So that there's no room for any idolatrous stuff. I remember I was in the Armagh Cathedral one time for the Church of Ireland. They've since removed this thing, but I remember going in there years and years ago and seeing a little statuette that was alongside of the cathedral on display as a museum piece, but it was an idol that had been dug up, out of the ground, in the locality somewhere, and just put on display and says, this is what the ancient Irish used to worship. But yet it was sitting in the cathedral. And I was like, this is mad. Why are you having an idol sitting in your church? And but probably the excuse was, oh, well, sure, it's just a display piece to, it's just, showing what the history of things are. Well, that thing belongs in a museum, not in a place of worship. Okay. So, so the first commandment is you shall have no other gods before me. And because when the Israelites came out of Egypt, they were fronted up with a whole pantheon of gods out of Egypt. So, and then the second commandment here is you shall make for yourself, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that which is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth, and you shall not bow to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. So the second commandment here is not making a carved image. And again, this is what the Hebrew people would have known. They would have seen this, is all kinds of carved images down in Egypt. So, and people bowing down to them and all that kind of stuff. And yet God, because he is spirit, because he is eternal in every respect, you cannot contain him. You cannot put him in a box. I mean, even Solomon said when the temple was being made, he says that building is not able to contain God. It's not possible. So, and he understood that. So, so some people, the Catholic Church in particular, in the days of the Reformation and that kind of thing, used a lot of iconography, used a lot of statues, and various sorts of things that would have then been perceived by those that were then in the Protestant movement, says, no, that's idolatrous, and we need to wipe that out. So, so you wouldn't have seen any really depictions of anything in Protestant churches. It was, four walls and a sermon, basically. I remember visiting a church in just outside of London a lot of years ago, Chalfont on Giles, or some sort of real leafy suburb of thing. You couldn't find a terraced house for much less than £1 million there. So, but anyway, we were staying with some people because I was over at a wedding, and we went to a Church of England that was just in the middle of the village, and it was an ancient church, and what they had found was drawings underneath the plaster. And it was very, very interesting because what had happened was Cromwell, in his vigor, went into all the churches of England at the time, and basically says, we can't have any of these drawings. And so he basically plastered them over in all the different churches. And but I think it was back in the 1930s, there was a bit of this plaster that crumbled off, and somebody spied that there was a bit of a drawing in there. And so they started taking the plaster off and realized that there was all these murals that were underneath the plaster. Now, the drawings were not depictions of God in any way. They were drawings of Bible stories. And so the reason they were there was because that's how they taught the people who couldn't read. They had pictures all over the place. I mean, if you, I'm just trying to think, look around here. Well, see, we're a typical Protestant church, don't have anything around here. But, but you might, look around in churches and see some banners or see some pictures about Bible stories and things like that. Well, that's what was up on these church walls. So, so the ministers, the priests, or whatever they were called, would have said, now, if you look up on the wall over there, there's the depiction of creation. there's the story of creation. There's Adam and Eve, and they, ate of the tree, and all that. So it was all very, very visual. And then they moved on to the next thing. It says over here, this is when Moses got the 10 Commandments. So they had a picture of a mountain, and Moses going up and receiving the command. So there was all these depictions of Bible stories, and that's how they taught the scriptures. So and then there would have been a central picture of Jesus on the cross. So everything that they could put up on the wall, they did. But yet Cromwell and other sorts of people came and says, no, can't be having that, and just plastered it all over. So now here in Ireland, where we have a lot of different depictions of things. If you go down to Monaster Boyce, which is down south of the border there, just before you get to Drogheda, you can go and visit the Monaster Boyce High Cross, which I've seen, and it's an absolutely extraordinary thing. And again, the teaching priests of the time, and you have to realize this is before the Reformation, so there would have been only one church system essentially, but a high cross was for the purpose of teaching the people biblical truth. So if you look at a high cross, especially the Monaster Boyce one, which is a very, very well-preserved one, there is one up in Drumore in the center of the town at the little roundabout there, but there ain't much of it left, so there's nothing much to see.
Cromwell knocked it down.
Yeah, Cromwell, okay, good for Cromwell, so our buddy. But if you look at all these stories that are carved into the cross, you see Adam and Eve, you see the 10 Commandments, you see all these Old Testament stories, and then as you go up the cross, you then see Jesus in the crucifixion, and then above that is the things about his resurrection. So and it's all 3D. It's all carved in. It's on one side, the other side, down the sides, all these biblical stories. And so, Protestant people get hung up on this stuff and say that no, that's all Catholic stuff and all that kind of thing. But really what they were doing was teaching the word of God through pictures.
Which is a good thing.
Which was a good thing.
Once you started to talk about that, it just brought me back to the amazing journey that we took around the school last year.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
Boards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that visually gets into a child's mind and stays there.
Yeah. So last week, when we were looking at the maps and different things like that, I mean, I could have stood up here and articulated and read out of the scriptures, highly important. We get all that information out of the Bible, but to be able to see it, it's like that sticks in one's mind. So, but anyway. But God cannot be represented, in a visual form. So because God is not like an idol. Okay, he's not a piece of wood. He's not a carved pillar or whatever. Now, there's an interesting word that's used here that some of you may not associate with God, and that is in the middle of verse 5, where it says, "For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God." Now, that sounds a bit strange. If you're honest, usually we associate jealousy with envy. If you're jealous of your wife, or your wife's jealous of you, or something like that, usually that happens because you might be doing something that your wife doesn't like, and she's going, what are you, and why are you with them? And why are you, so or we might become jealous of somebody that has maybe more than we do. I wish I had their stuff, and but that's envy. Now, God is not envious of anything in the world. He's not envious of anything. Okay. He's not jealous of anything, but he is jealous for his name. And that is, he does not desire, nor can he tolerate competition. So we have to look in our lives and say, is there competition going on in our lives? Because, God is exclusive. God God desires worship from yourself exclusively. He's not there to be shared. Okay. So, so God's making this very, very clear, saying, I am the only show in town here. So, so God is not jealous of anything, but he is jealous for his name. Now, the third commandment, and these are all related to God here. So you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. And you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So this is a lot deeper than what we would regard as people taking the Lord's name in vain. You know, I'm not going to say it, you know, obviously because it's a bad term, but it's a much deeper thing. Okay, you know, when we use God's name inappropriately, that's wrong, that's bad, but that's not really what this is about here. This is about mishandling, you know, God to the core, because the name of the Lord our God, you know, when you don't understand his name, you don't worship him right. When you know what the name of God is about, then you will respect him and you'll reverence him in every aspect of your living and your thinking. So, because the name of the Lord is something that again the Jews did not pronounce. Because they held it in such high regard, even when they wrote it out on their scrolls. When their pen was used to write out the name of the Lord, they would actually say a prayer over the writing of the name. And once they were done writing the name, then they would break the pen in half, because the pen had done its ultimate job, which was to write the name of God. There was nothing higher than that. And and the name of the Lord describes God as being completely self-existent, you know, meaning that God does not need any energy or power outside of himself to exist. So, you know, God is completely and utterly unique, you know, so because, you know, we may not take the Lord's name in vain, as it were, with our words, but we can take the name of the Lord's name in vain by our actions and how we respect God before people and before himself. So the next one here, the fourth commandment, is remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So, again, this is about the worship of God. All these have to do with the person of God, and so God set apart a day. Okay, so so there's 6 days in which we work, and the seventh day is hallowed by God. It's not because, you know, God, when God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh, it wasn't because he was tired. It was because he was done. Okay, so now it's interesting that out of the 10 commandments, this is the only commandment that Christ does not reiterate. All the other ones he does in the New Testament. But this one he doesn't reiterate, because he himself is the Sabbath. He himself is the completion. You know, we are complete in him. We are done. In fact, that's what he said when off the cross there, is it is accomplished, it is finished. So so we can therefore rest in him. Now, I think the principle of Sabbath is a good thing to follow. And we have to remember that technically the Sabbath is not Sunday. The Sabbath is Saturday. That's the seventh day of the week. So within certain Presbyterian circles, they would, some of them would actually call Sunday the Sabbath. Well, that's not right. That's not right. So anyway, because the Sabbath is Saturday. So, but the principle of Sabbath, which is, resting on a seventh day, because the Christians met on the first day of the week. That's quite clear in the New Testament. That was their Sabbath in a sense. Okay. Now the Jews also had other holy days that they regarded as Sabbaths. So the likes of Passover, for instance, Passover for the Jews this past week was on Wednesday, I think it was. So it wasn't Saturday. Okay, that's a special Sabbath. Yes. So if you remember, we went through that whole business about the death of Christ, and the conclusion that we came to was that Christ didn't die on Friday, Christ died on Thursday. So because the Sabbath of the Passover actually was on the Friday, and then there was the following Sabbath, which was on the Saturday. So if you read the scriptures right, you see that that's the case, because it was awful difficult to figure out how was Jesus dead 3 days and 3 nights, and he died on Friday and rose again on Sunday morning. It's just you can't make any sense out of that. So Christ had to have died on Thursday. So, but anyway, that was if you want to go and look it up on YouTube and see all that, then, but I think, in terms of work, there is this principle of working, as it were, 6 days and resting on some seventh day. Our founder of Starus, Arthur, he had a Sabbath principle that he used in his work, and that is he would work and minister for 6 weeks, and then on the 7th week he would not see anybody. It's not that he didn't do anything, but it would be that he wouldn't see clients, and he wouldn't preach. And so he took the 7th week kind of off, as it were. So again, not that he wasn't doing anything, but it was a change of pace. And that actually helped Arthur over many, many decades to actually not burn himself out. So I thought it was a good principle. So, but a lot of us in full-time Christian work, unfortunately, we burn ourselves out and burn the candle at both ends, is because we feel that we have to save the world out there or something. So, but God, and Jesus told his disciples, let's come apart and rest a while. Yes, yeah. Every 7, the 7th year, they had what was called Shemitah, which was the resting of the fields. So so for the 6 years, they would then plant crops, and the Lord blessed on the 6th year and gave them actually 3 times as much produce, because that would cover that year, would cover the Sabbath year, and then it would cover the year going into the next cycle. So, but the Jews didn't practice Shemitah. They didn't do it, and the land needed its rest, and that's why there were 70 years of captivity when the Jews were taken into captivity. It was because for 490 years they did not practice this. They did not do what God had called them to do, and then God's going, time to play catch up. So 70 years worth of rest. So that's so they were taken into captivity for that period of time. And you can see that in 2 Chronicles in chapter 36 or whatever it is. It says that. It says the land needed its rest. So Now,
Here's what people thinking, you know, I know better than God, or
yeah, absolutely. So, but you know, it's going back to then. If you obey and keep, then this happens.
Tell you to do something and not reward you
Yeah,
by doing it.
yeah,
But suppose green,
yeah,
you know, we're thinking, we're not 7th year.
yeah.
So now they've discovered that in these countries where you work 7 days a week, that was actually far more production whenever the people didn't work 7 days in a week.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know, God's work or God's word works regardless of whether you're a believer in him or not, really, because those principles work. Right. The next commandments here have to do with how you deal with each other. Okay, so the 5th commandment is honor your father and mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. So, you know, as we look at our world today, we would see an awful lot of situations where mother and father are not being honored. You know, so I mean, what is it in Sweden or Norway or one of those countries? You can actually divorce your parents. You know, so, you know, as a child, I think you could be like 7 or something like this, and you know, you can make a decision and say, no, I don't like my parents. I think they're, you know, a bunch of headers, and so I want to get shot of them. So, you know, you know, when you start to disassemble God's order, everything, you get disorder. It just completely breaks down. So, so this is a very, now, this is not to say that there aren't abusive fathers and mothers that, you know, mishandle their kids and that kind of thing. That kind of stuff does exist, and that's because of the fall. But, you know, if in a world where you're seeking to honor God, you know, what you do is you honor your father and your mother. That works. So, then we get into the thou shalt nots. Okay, so verse 13 there, it says, you shall not murder. Okay, so now some of the translations would say, thou shalt not kill. Okay, but really the terminology is better saying, you shall not murder. Okay, because murder is a premeditated action that you take against your neighbor for vengeance or, you know, some sort of self-serving exercise. Because if it was purely you shall not kill, then, you know, going to war against the enemy would have been just a breakage of every, you know, all those kinds of commandments. So this is about murder, because God is the one who gives life, preserves life, and God is the one who also takes life. That's his prerogative, not yours. And then you shall not commit adultery. So now this has to do with the sacredness of a man and a woman together, because when God looks at this, he sees Christ's love for the church, because again, in Ephesians 5, this is what it says: husbands, love your wives as Christ loves the church. So that's a huge spiritual truth. And so God is saying here, don't commit adultery. In other words, don't break that bond, don't interfere with that, because if you do, it's going to cause all kinds of mayhem, all kinds of problems. And so so we again see this in the world. So adultery is a bad thing.
Did you ever hear of what is called the Wicked Bible?
No.
I think it is 1627 edition of the King James Bible.
Right.
And the word not is left out.
Oh.
That's what it's called. So it reads, you shall commit
Adultery.
Now, historians argue over it. It's obviously a printing error. Was it a mistake? Or was it done deliberately by the guy who was the king's printer who was losing his contract? He got fined £10,000, which is a massive of money in those days.
Yeah. Yeah,
But that
so,
particular
so,
Bible-
so that particular Bible, in that particular commandment,
Yeah,
uh-huh,
just for 1 year, but that Bible today is worth millions.
oh, I'm sure. Mhm.
It's just worth.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah.
You have it printed.
Yeah.
Suppose it's out in your garage.
Yeah.
But then, you know, it is clear the commandment is thou shalt not.
Yeah, yeah.
He deliberately, man deliberately left that out,
Mhm.
to sabotage the Bible.
So, no, it's, no, that's interesting. So, and so he got his head handed to him on a plate, you know, with
More or
the,
less,
yeah,
yes.
so, anyway. Right, the next thou shalt not is thou shalt not steal, okay? So, because stealing is completely opposite to giving, okay? So, you know, stealing is taking, that which is not yours. So the opposite of that is giving. God is a giver. So if you steal, you're then going completely and utterly contrary to the nature of God. So if you look at these three thou shalt nots, you know, thou shalt not murder, that's about the taking of life. God is a God of life. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Well, God is a God of fidelity. You know, God is a God of loyalty. God is a God of grace and forgiveness. You know, thou shalt not steal. Well, that flies in the face of giving, because, you know, God is a God who gives. Then verse 16, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now that's talking about telling lies, or as you all call them in Northern Ireland, porkies. So I didn't know what a porky was when I first got here, you know, so, but then I realized it was porky pies, lies, is all that Cockney nonsense, you know, so anyway. But, and then we talk about telling wheat porkies, you know, so, but, you know, God is about truth. So that's the nature of God. These are all commandments that talk really much about the nature of who God is. You know, and that's what he said in verse 2 there. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of bondage. So, you know, doing these things reflects who God is. And then finally, you shall not covet your neighbor's house, nor shall you covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. So, and now coveting is lusting after something that is not yours, nor can it be yours legitimately. Okay. So, now I struggle a little bit sometimes when people make this statement. They say, oh, I covet your prayers for me. You may have heard that within certain contexts. That's the wrong use of the word covet to me. The word covet is a negative word, and it has to do with lusting and desiring something that is not yours. Now it says in Colossians to flee and put to death covetousness, which is idolatry. Because if you enter into covetousness, you will be looking at your neighbor's thing, whether it's their stuff or their wife or whatever, and go, you know, I want that. I'm going to get it. I'm looking at it. And by golly, I'm going to get it. You know, and then once you get it, then you have to go and hide it because it ain't yours. You know, and this is what happens. What happened with the sin of Achan in Joshua chapter 7, when Achan had taken the stuff under the ban when Jericho was taken. Joshua said to him, "Tell me what you've done." And this is what Achan says. Achan says, "I saw the stuff. I coveted it. I took it. And then I hid it." All within one verse. And I remember teaching on that verse years ago, and there was a guy that was in our meeting who struggled with drink and painkillers. That was sort of his vices. And I remember him saying to me in that meeting, he says, "I have never seen myself so clearly." He says, that's what I do. I see things, I covet things, I take things, and therefore I have to hide them. So
remember listening to a sermon. Here. And it was on that. And the whole thing was all about, and we shouldn't be standing up in the town and looking into the shop window and wanting that was in the window. And I remember thinking to myself, that's actually garbage.
Yeah.
That can be legitimately yours.
Yes.
And whereas that verse is all solely to do with your neighbor.
Yep. Yes.
It's
Yeah.
everything belonging to your neighbor. It's not something that
Yeah.
you can legitimately.
No, you cannot have legitimately your neighbor's wife. You cannot. So, but now the interesting thing that Catholics do with the Ten Commandments, though, because they have 10 commandments too, but they're slightly different. What the Catholics do is they split up the last commandment here, thou shalt not covet, into two. And they leave out the one that says you shall not make a graven image. So in the Catholic set of 10 commandments, you shall not make a graven image is down the road, because that otherwise that they could not justify their use of statues.
Where did the split that? Where did you know in that last?
Well, what they do is they say you shall not covet your neighbor's goods, nor shall you covet your, and the second is you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. So that's how they split that. So anyway, probably a lot of you didn't know that, but that's what they do. So
I knew that the split one of them had done away with.
Yeah.
With the thing. But
yeah, so anyway. Right. So just a couple of little notes here, and then we'll talk about the tabernacle sort of briefly here. So the commandments were divided into two broad categories. One is how to respect and revere God, and how to treat your neighbor. Okay, so that is the very broad set of things. How to respect and revere God, and how to worship God. So the first four commandments actually lend itself to that. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make a graven image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God name in vain. And you shall keep the Sabbath. So those four things have to do with dealing with God, how to respect, how to revere God. The rest of them, honoring your father and mother, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness, shall not covet. Those six is about how to treat your neighbor. Okay. Now, what Jesus said in Matthew 22 is a man came up to him and said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" So what Jesus then said was, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind," which was a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. And he says, "This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself," which is taken from Leviticus 19:18. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Okay. So, so it's about loving God and loving your neighbor. So if you want to go and try to balance anything up and figure it out, just ask yourself, does it feed into one of these two camps? Now, within Exodus, in addition to the 10 commandments, there were 52 other commands that had to do with worship and social justice within the book of Exodus. But when you take into account the whole of the Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, there are 613 commandments. Okay, all of which can be seated into those two categories of how do you deal with God, how do you deal with your neighbor. Now, a lot of the 613 commandments have to do with sacrificial systems. And there's a lot that has to do with dietary stuff, relationships, all kinds of things. So, but there's 613. So it's not just the 10 commandments, it's 613. Lots of them. So, and the Israelites enjoyed the presence of the Lord via the tabernacle, because once they got the 10 commandments and those things initially situated, they had the law on these tablets, then what God wanted to do is he wanted to presence himself in the midst. Okay. So basically we have a tabernacle. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the layout of the tabernacle, and then I'm going to show you a short video of what the tabernacle sort of situation looked like, which I think is quite good. Because you know, sometimes when you try to describe these things, even with diagrams, you're kind of going, yeah, what's you know, what's the size or what's the whatever. So anyway, the video is quite helpful. So, but anyway, the layout of the tabernacle that is initially described in Exodus 25 and following, and the top portion of the tabernacle area is the north. Okay, so that's north is up, south is down, east is that way, and west is that way. Okay, so so we'll start from the east. Okay, so the gate, and there was a bit of a curtainy fence that was around the whole thing. So right at the very east edge, I know this doesn't kind of go that far, was a gate, and basically that was a curtain that could be moved apart. And so the first thing that you encountered was the brazen altar, which was a thing about 7 foot by 7 foot or so, and that's where sacrifices were burned. Okay, that's where sacrifices were done, and blood was then put on the horns of that altar, which were on the corners. That'll make sense when you see the video. And then there was what was called a bronze lever, and that was a big pool of water. And so the priests had to wash their hands in the water before going in, and they actually wash their feet as well before going into the holy place, which is the square where you see the golden candlestick and the table of showbread and the altar of incense. Those were the 3 pieces of furniture inside this tent. The tent was covered with a variety of coverings. Now, you have to realize that there are no windows inside this tent. So once you get inside the tent, it's dark. Okay. Now, it wasn't dark, and that was because of the golden candlestick, which was lit 24 hours a day. So now we'll talk about those things as we get there. And then there was another curtain, another veil, and then on the in the Holy of Holies there was the Ark of the Covenant, which had 3 items in it. It had the law on the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. It had the rod which budded, and Aaron's rod that budded, and then it also had a jar of manna sitting in there. So, and that is where the high priest went once a year on the Day of Atonement and brought blood from the sacrifice to present before God. And it was at the Ark of the Covenant, which was where God and his glory was. Okay, so, but that had to be set apart. You couldn't just willy-nilly walk in there and say, "Hi, God," or something like that. You know, that was a death thing. So now, traditionally, there was this idea that when the high priest went in behind the veil, he went in with a rope around his foot, because if the priest had gone in and did anything untoward and was struck dead by God, then they had the opportunity to go and pull him out, because you did not go in to get him. Now, there's no record of that having happened, and it's more oral, probably tradition and that kind of thing, but it's just interesting to think about. Now, let me, okay, now, I think the video sort of showed, you know, sort of the layout of the place. That's an actual physical representation. So you could see like the little animals, you know, the little sheep and stuff that were there. So that's a place that you can go to in Israel to visit. So it's of the proper dimensions and everything there. So, but so what we'll do is we'll kind of work backwards from the inside to the outside. And the first thing that is inside the Holy of Holies, and this would have been, the piece of furniture that was essential for worship. The other things kind of disappeared along the way, but yet the Ark of the Covenant was the thing that survived. But this, you see the two angels that are there, and this is all described in Exodus as to how this would be constructed and built. It was a small chest. It was made of acacia wood, and it was overlaid with pure gold. And that would, the wood would speak of the Lord Jesus Christ in terms of his humanity, and the gold would speak of Jesus Christ in terms of his divinity. But where the glory of God rested while they camped, and the whole operation was designed to be transported. Okay, so it was temporary structures, so where God was between the cherubim. Okay, that's where what was called the Shekinah glory of God was. Okay, so and that presence, that cloud, would rise out of the top of the tabernacle of meeting. So the people knew the presence of God because they saw it. Okay, now when God chose to move the camp on, his glory would get up and go. Okay, and so what the Israelites did was they had certain families. There was a whole procedure and structure as to how to pack all this stuff up and transport it, and everybody moved. And then when the cloud stopped, then they set up camp. The glory of God came into the tabernacle meeting, and so they moved as God led them. So so that top lid where the cherubim are sitting, that is what is referred to as the mercy seat. And so the high priest would go in once a year on the Day of Atonement, apply blood to the top of that mercy seat, and that would deal with the sins of the people for a year. Okay. And then the 10 Commandments and the other items are inside the box. You see the poles that are there. God was very, very specific about how this was to be transported. It was to be transported by a certain family of Levites. They would hoist it up on their shoulders. So you had a man in the front, man in the back, and they would carry this on their shoulders. So it was not to be carried in any other way. And we know from the scriptures that when you tried to do this, it was not good. Okay. People died as a result of not carrying the thing properly. In fact, tradition again has it that the poles that went through the rings there on the corner of the box, the pole actually didn't touch the ring, the inside of the ring, because the things of God could not be touched by the things of man. That's how exclusive God was, and that's how holy God was. That the things of man could not touch the things of God. So even the holy thing that man was touching in terms of a pole didn't even touch the things of God, and it was suspended. So this was the only item that was in the Holy of Holies. There is some scriptures that suggests that perhaps the altar of incense might have been in there too, but the majority of indication is that it was sitting out in the holy place. So this was the only item that was in the Holy of Holies, and that's where God was. So pulling out, then you had what was called the golden lampstand, or the menorah. All right, that had 7 candles on it that were powered by olive oil. And again, what the tradition is that the first 2 drops of oil that came out of any given olive, which was the best oil, that was reserved for the menorah. So that took a lot of very careful parceling out of oil, So because the first oil that you get out of olives is what's called extra virgin oil. So when you go to Tesco's and you get olive oil, you see olive oil, and then you see extra virgin oil. So the extra virgin oil is the best oil, and that's the first oil batch that you get off of pressed olives. So the kind of stock standard olive oil is the stuff that comes afterwards, you know. So and there was a process that they had of extracting that oil, but the best oil was reserved for the menorah. And these lamps were trimmed both morning and evening so that light was continually being given inside the tent of meeting. And so this would speak of the Spirit of God who illumines the things of God. You know, the only reason you can understand anything about God is because the Spirit of God shows it to you. Otherwise, you're in the dark. So that's what, you know, that is about. That was made of a single piece of gold. So anyway, very elaborate construction of the thing. So probably about on height. So it was fairly big. And if you had a gold thing that was that size, it'd be heavy. But it was made of one. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, you can buy little menorahs if you want to, but yeah. So, but it is a, you know, all these things within the tabernacle meeting, Jesus Christ fulfilled in every way. Now, going back here to the Ark of the Covenant, one of the speculations, I could call it that, is that when nobody knows where the Ark of the Covenant is. Okay, it is nobody knows where it's located at this. There's great speculation about where this thing is and where it sits, and there's a lot of people out there, a lot of religious kind of Christian sort of people say, "Oh yeah, we know where it is. We ain't telling you." So there's a lot of religious groups that say, "We got it, but we're not showing it to you." Well, that's because they don't got it. So, but there is this idea that the ark is actually buried under Calvary. And the ark is sitting right below where Christ died. And the blood that he shed when he died on the cross went into the ground and was deposited between the cherubim as a sacrifice. But it wasn't for just one day of atonement. It was forever.
It's interesting too, that maybe you should be outline of the whole
Mm-hmm.
example about the Eastern Gate, where Jesus will come down
Yes.
to Jerusalem.
Yeah, through the Eastern Gate. Yeah. So anyway, there's the menorah again. So then there's the table of showbread. A lot of these things are described in the Bible, but their purpose is not described really. So a lot of what I'm saying in terms of, you know, how Christ fulfills this really is based much upon, you know, sort of the theological idea that, you know, that the earthly tabernacle that we had was a representation of a heavenly tabernacle that Christ was in. And so that was one not made with hands. That was in the heavenly places. We'll get to that when we get to the book of Hebrews, because it talks about all them things. But the table of showbread had 12 loaves on it. Each loaf was representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. They were replaced every Sabbath, I think. Yeah, once a week. Those loaves were replaced. But in terms of what Christ, how Christ fulfills this, he is the bread of life. And the bread was always present. And, you know, it never went stale because it was always replenished. But he himself is that bread.
Would they have done with that showbread whenever they were tested?
The priests would have fed it. Yes. Yeah. So that was food for the priests. So and that's why it was a bit of a big deal when David went into the tabernacle meeting and he ate the bread, which the priests were only supposed to eat, and that was kind of a bad thing, you know. But at least from their perspective. But so now you can see the poles on the table of showbread there. So all these things actually had poles, you know, that were used to carry these things. They were not supposed to be transported on carts, wheels, any kinds of man-made mechanisms. You know, they were supposed to be carried by designated families of priests. And then we have the altar of incense, which was right there at the curtain. You know, when Jesus was born, he was given gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so we got gold there, in frankincense is incense, and that was for the purpose of worship for God. And what that was about was the prayers of God's people would ascend to God as a sweet smelling savor, as it were. And but how much better that the Lord Jesus Christ prays for you, and his prayers ascend as a sweet smelling savor to God. So when Christ was a baby and the wise men brought the gold, which represented Christ's royalty, they brought incense, which represents Christ's deity in terms that he is God, he is the one that deserves worship. But they also brought myrrh, which was a really strange thing to bring to a kid because that had to do with his death. Because what you used myrrh for was to embalm the body. So he had all these three things that we're talking about, how Christ would fulfill as king, how Christ would fulfill as priest, and as Christ would fulfill as sacrifice. Now that was the size of that thing is 1 cubit by 1 cubit. So cubit is the length of your arm, you know, here. So that's the width of the thing square. Okay. The bronze lever is then the thing that's outside of the tent of meeting. So that was this big bowl that was outside, and that's where the priests would wash their hands and their feet, and certainly the Lord Jesus Christ, before he went in, as it were, to sacrifice himself, he was perfect. And then they had the altar of burnt offering, which is the thing that big, large box that sat outside the tent there.
Pilate was trying to release Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He washed his hands.
Yeah.
Significant there as well, isn't it?
Yes, well, he was trying to wash his hands of the responsibility, you know. So, but yeah, it's interesting how the washing of hands kind of applies to a lot of different things. But so really much of the rest of Exodus talks about these things, talks about these the tabernacle of meeting, and next week we'll finish up Exodus and sort of talk about a few other little odds and ends in terms of procedures and what was done. But I just wanted to sort of show you what these things look like and what their significance was in Christian terms. So that I think is us. Yep. Okay.
I think the weight was that they not bold.
Well, they
Follow.
would.